So we're going to begin our lesson on the diversity of living things. A couple of things that I want to preface all this with is, why is this even important? Well, classifying things is important because it helps us have a way of explaining things in a way that others can understand it. For instance, I have people come up to me all the time saying, what kind of plant is this? Or what kind of bug is this? Or what kind of rock is this? And I have a way of figuring it out because I know, well, for instance, with plants, are the leaves lobed, or are they toothed, or are they smooth? Because then that can help me to know, do I look up this grouping of plants or this grouping of plants, and it narrows my search. And so it's good to have a common way of classifying things. And so we'll talk about the different things that we can classify and the characteristics that make us able to classify them. Don't forget to do your warm up and to turn those in Friday. Some things that we need to be looking out for as we take our notes and fill out our note-taking guide is we need to name the three domains. There's technically, some scientists would argue there's two main domains, eukaryotic and prokaryotic, but we're going to go with the three domain naming system and four kingdoms and what are those characteristics of those. We're going to explain the importance of bacteria and fungus in the environment and describe the role of protists in the ocean environment. We'll also describe how organisms interact and depend on each other for survival. So this one's like more encompassing. It's going to be throughout the whole PowerPoint. So be listening for all the different examples. So let's get started. Most scientists classify organisms into three domains and four kingdoms based on different characteristics. Members of the three domains get their food in different ways, and that's how we classify them, and are made of different types of cells, which is another way to classify them, and the smallest unit, which the cells are the smallest unit of biological organization, as we talked about earlier when we were talking about levels of biological organization. The cells of animals, plants, and fungi and protists all contain a nucleus. So there's another way of categorizing things is, does it have membrane-bound organelles or does it not have membrane-bound organelles? While cells of bacteria, fungi, and plant cells have cell walls. So there's another way. Does it have cell walls? Does it not have cell walls? What are those cell walls made up of? And is it unicellular or is it multicellular? Do they get their food through uh, obtaining it from their environment through like sunlight or chemicals, or do they have to go and consume something to get theirs? And are they decomposing? Those are all different ways, things that we can do and use to categorize organisms and classify them based on those characteristics. So the first two is archaea and bacteria. Archaea is bacteria, but it's a different kind. They differ in their genetics. They're, in a manner of speaking, simpler, and the makeup of their cell wall, what their cell wall is actually made of. Bacteria are microscopic. They're unicellular organisms that usually have a cell wall and reproduce by cell division or binary fission. Unlike all other organisms, bacteria and archaea lack a nuclei. Bacteria and archaea live in every habitat on Earth. I mean, every surface on Earth, including our bodies. So I want to throw this in here, archaea, the difference between archaea and bacteria to really clarify it. Archaea, their cell walls are made of protein. Bacteria, their cell walls are made of peptidoglycan or a sugar protein complex. That's the main difference that we use between the two. Archaea doesn't usually respond to antibiotics because they're very resilient. Archaea is like the extremophiles. They're the ones that are able to deal with the environments that no other organism can. And they have DNA or RNA for their protein synthesis, and they have protein synthesis machinery. Like I said, they're extremophiles, and their reproduction is similar to that of bacteria. Instead of being extremophiles, they're mesophiles. Um, so they have many things in common. But again, the main thing are what the cell walls are made up of, and that archaea are extremophiles. Some kinds of bacteria can break down remains of waste in other organisms and return those nutrients back to the soil. So there are bacteria buddies, and others recycle nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus. If it wasn't for bacteria, plants and us really would not be able to get nitrogen in the form that it needs to be in to uh, be our nutrients. It would stay locked up as the gas form that as it's in the air. So bacteria has a symbiotic relationship with many root hairs of plants so that we can get nitrogen in the soil. Certain bacteria, so we call that nitrification. Bacteria also allow many organisms, including humans, to extract certain nutrients from their food as well. If it wasn't for Escherichia coli or E. coli, get these highlighted words down in your notes. If it wasn't for them and them being located in the intestine of our guts and the way they get there is through our foods, we wouldn't be able to turn many of those foods into the vitamins that our body really needs. So here's a picture of that. Fungus is an organism whose cells have a nuclei, rigid cell walls, so that's what makes it different from us, the animal kingdom, and no chlorophyll, and that belongs uh, to the kingdom fungi. So they aren't photosynthetic like plants. In fact, they don't even breathe like plants. They actually breathe in oxygen like we do and breathe out CO2. But so they're a lot more like us than they are like plants in many ways. But they do have a cell wall, unlike our animal cells. Like many skeletons that allow fungi to stand up, it allows them to stand upright, just like it allows plants to stand upright. It gives them structural support. So they don't have to have inner skeletons like we do. A mushroom is a reproductive structure of the fungus. The rest of the fungus is actually underground, making this big giant network of fibers that absorb food and decay organisms in the soil. Maybe you've noticed this before. There would be like a big giant circle of mushrooms, and some people call them fairy rings. Well, the reason why is because in the center of that circle, what you can't see going on is it's spread out from the center and then comes up at the surface, uh, making a perimeter or circumference that you can see as a ring. But underneath, they're all tied together at one central point under the ground. Fungi get their food by releasing chemicals that help break down organic matter and then reabsorb them. So that makes them what we call decomposers. The bodies of most fungi are huge networks of threads that grow through the soil, dead wood, or other material on which fungus is feeding. So if it wasn't for these guys breaking down stuff like the bacteria, then you would have a lot of dead organic matter lying around. We'd be buried in it. So they play a very important role in breaking down the bodies of dead organisms. Get that down in your notes. Some fungi, like some bacteria, also can cause disease, such as athlete's foot, for example, or yeast infections. These are caused by a fungus. Other fungi add flavor to food, as in blue cheese. The fungus gives the cheese both the blue color and a strong flavor. So we can thank them for our bread and we can thank them for our cheeses, but we can also not thank them, I suppose you could say, for athlete's feet and other conditions that come from a fungal infection. Yeast are fungi that produce a gas that makes our bread rise. So if you really think about it, those gas bubbles or the rising of the bread is really like belches or farts of a fungus, if you want to think of it that way. Protists are one of the most diverse organisms. In fact, I like to think of protists as like that extra group that you can't really call them a plant, you can't really call them animals. So let's just throw them in this category, the protist. Um, some are like the amoebas, like Kirby, are animal-like. Others are plant-like, like these diatoms, or more specifically, like the kelp. And some resemble more like a fungi, like a Voxarella. Most protists are unicellular, but there are some that are multicellular and form these big colonies. They're microscopic organisms, including diatoms, which are pictured here, which float in the on the ocean surface. This is something you could see in reflectors and things like that. The reflective materials made of diatoms, or the diatomaceous earth, or the in a lot of pool filters. Another protist, such as Plasmodium, pictured here, is the unicellular organism that causes the disease malaria, which is carried by mosquitoes. So it's not the mosquitoes really that cause malaria, it's that causes malaria. From an environmental standpoint, the most important protist is algae. Algae are plant-like protists that can make their own food and use light's energy from the sun. So they form the base of the initial food source of most ocean and freshwater ecosystems. So since it's that important, let's get that down in our notes. They do make their own food using sunlight, so they're autotrophs, and they're photosynthetic autotrophs, by the way. And they range in size from the giant kelp to the unicellular phytoplankton. Plants are multicellular organisms that make their own food using sunlight, so they're photosynthetic autotrophs as well. They have a cell wall, and most plants live on land where they use their leaves to get the sunlight. And they breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, giving us the air that we breathe, while absorbing nutrients and water from the soil through their roots. Leaves and roots are connected by vascular tissue, which has thick cell walls and serves as a system of piping, if you will, or of tubes that carries water and food. Carries food from the leaves that were producing it through photosynthesis, and carries water from the roots up through the rest of it, and also nutrients in the soil through the roots. Plants with no vascular tissue are called non-vascular plants, such as this moss here. They lack specialized tissue like root systems and stems and leaves. So the water must then move throughout the plant. So that's why they're always so tiny, so that water can just wash over them. And so they have to live. You'll find them living in damp places. Gymnosperms are woody vascular seed plants whose seeds are not enclosed by an ovary or fruit, so they're more in these cones. They're cone bearing. We call them gymnosperms, stands for a naked seed. So if you open this, you could see the seeds inside the ridges of this cone here, such as in pine trees or other conifers. Much of our lumber and paper comes from this group. Gymnosperms have several adaptations that allow them to live in these dry conditions. They can produce pollen, which protects and moves sperm between the plants. So when you see this big coating of yellow all over your car and things, that's usually from gymnosperms. These plants also produce seeds, which protect the developing plant from drying out, and needle-like leaves also, so that they can prevent water loss. Angiosperms is another category. These are the flowering plants. They produce seeds within a fruit. So many of our fruits come, and some of our vegetables come from this group, where we're eating the ripened ovary there. Most land plants are angiosperms. The flower is the reproductive structure, and some angiosperms, like grasses, have small flowers that use the wind to disperse their pollen. Other angiosperms have large flowers that attract. That's what the whole point of these petals are, is as a road sign saying, come here, pollinator, please, and carry off my pollen to another plant. Most land animals are dependent on these flowering plants to eat them, such as wheat, rice, and beans, or building materials, such as the fibers in the oak and the cotton. Animals cannot make their own food, so we call them heterotrophs because they must consume other things to get their food. So animals have no cell walls. That makes them different from many of the other classifications. And so their bodies are soft and flexible. That one advantage, but the disadvantage is that we have to come up with then skeletons to help support and to give our muscles something to pull against so that we can move our bodies. As a result, animals are much more mobile than plants. All animals move around in their environment during at least one stage in their lives, such as these invertebrates, which are animals that don't have a backbone. So, no backbone there in that earthworm. Many like to attach to hard surfaces, such as rocks, or and filter their food out of the water, such as in corals and various worms and mollusks. They'll attach themselves to the sides of rocks or the sides of the corals or sides of other animals and get their nutrients as it's being filtered through the water. These organisms then will only be mobile during their larval stage once in their life. Invertebrates Other invertebrates include squids in the ocean and insects on land. Some have like these exoskeletons, like many insects do. Insects are successful for many reasons. They have waterproof exoskeleton. They can reproduce very quickly, just like this fly here, and they're small, so that allows them to live on less food and allows them to hide more easily from their enemies in smaller places. Invertebrates such as insects and many insects and plants have evolved together and depend upon each other, such as bees and flowers. They carry the pollen from the fruit and then to fertilize and plant the plant's egg, which develops into fruit such as tomatoes, cucumbers, and apples. So we depend on these insects to do that job. Insects are also valuable because they eat other insects that we consider them to be pests. Take, for instance, the ladybug, which eats the aphids that attack our plants. However, insects and humans can often be enemies. Take our blood-sucking mosquitoes that carry on things like the West Nile virus, or like we talked about earlier, malaria, or sleeping sickness that's caused by the kissing bug. They call it the kissing bug or bed bug. Insects do most damage indirectly by eating our crops as well, so damaging our crops, and then we can't eat them. Vertebrates are animals with a backbone, and that includes mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. The first vertebrates would have been the fish, but today most vertebrates live on land. The first land vertebrates could have been the reptiles. These animals were successful because they have an almost waterproof egg, which allows the egg to hatch on land away from predators in the water. So theirs is more like leather-like, whereas with birds who are warm-blooded instead of cold-blooded, they have feathers and their eggs are more hard-shelled. They're young or warm until they have developed are kept warm until they have developed insulating layers of fat and feather to keep themselves warm. Other vertebrates are like mammals, who instead of having feathers, they have fur or hair, and mammals get their name from the fact that they feed their young milk. Birds and mammals have the ability to maintain a high body temperature, which allows them to live in cold areas where other animals cannot live. And so we can conclude with this chart. If you will get down the characteristics, if you will get down the 3 domains that we've talked about, that if you will get down the 4 kingdoms that we talked about, and I've given you the examples already. All this is like a review or a recap of the notes. So get that down in your notes. As well as that last question that we talked about, which is um, their interactions with their environment. You saw many of those instances throughout where we highlighted those, where we've talked about those and emphasized that without these animals, certain things would not take place in the environment and certain organisms wouldn't be able to survive the way they are able to survive. All right, get those down in your notes and turn them in and have a good day.